Thank you so much for having me. It's an absolute honor and a privilege to be able to share something of what God's been doing in, through, and around, around me as we kind of navigate this whole, as I'm still navigating what it means to honor God, what it means to really shine the light of Christ in a totally different space. And so I'm going to be taking you on somewhat of a journey and just sharing some of these stories and some of the grappling, some of the tension that was mentioned earlier on today, as I spell out the journey that I've gone on. I'm going to do the techie stuff now. It is time for me to share my screen. Sometimes this can be a bit more difficult than it might appear. So yeah, that seems all right. I'm just going to make sure I move this out of the way, go to slide from there. And then if I go play from start, we should be all okay. Can you see that? Perfect. So if I had a title for today, it will be called Keep Shining. Keep Shining. And as we'll see, I guess the main text to kind of underpin the journey that we're going to go on is that powerful passage in Matthew where Jesus refers to his disciples, he refers to us as salt and as light. What's powerful is that Jesus doesn't say you are like salt and you are like, he says you are salt and you are light. And when I think about this whole theme of stories of hope, I'm encouraged actually that God positions us in places to be his beacons of hope as salt and as light. So as just a brief introduction about myself, I have the absolute privilege of running a coaching company called Innerscope. And in short, we work with students and staff teams, we work with learners and leaders. But I haven't always been doing this as our dear friend Luke shared. In fact, my background was predominantly in youth ministry. So this is a little snapshot taken many years ago on the estate where I grew up. And it was also the place that I was privileged to be a youth minister. So I was a youth minister on Andover Estate. I actually grew up here and lived here for a long portion of time in my life. It was where, as a young person growing up, it was kind of where I learned about a lot of things. It's kind of where I by God's grace, managed to avoid a few things that could have had me going down all sorts of journeys. That's maybe for another time. But God in his love, God in his redemptive foresight, saw it fit to not only bring me to him by his grace, but to keep me in the community where I grew up. And it was funny actually, because I had the privilege of being a senior detached youth worker for the Islington Council. And in a few years after, as I continue to walk with the Lord, an opportunity arose for me to become a youth minister at a church that was just outside the estate. It became very clear to me, whether I was doing youth work for the council or doing youth ministry with the local church, God had placed me in my local area to be salt and light. He had placed me to be someone that points to his redemptive hope. But it came with challenges. It came with real challenge, actually. And I think that's, as we grapple with this notion of hope, I think actually one of the things that makes hope subversive is that sometimes what makes hope something of significance and substance is that oftentimes it shows itself in context where it's easy not to have it, where it's easy to be hopeless. What was very funny about the area where I grew up as a youth minister is, in one sense, it kind of reminded me in one sense of the reputation that Nazareth had back in the day. What good can come from Nazareth? What good can come from Andover Estate? And there was a variety of situations that took place that either kind of reinforced this notion or kind of was subversive in the face of it. So a practical example, for instance, is in 2008, we literally had ITV come onto the estate. They descended on the estate. And I don't want to get too political, but it was with Anne Widdecombe. And this particular show was called Anne Widdecombe versus the Hoodies. And on this ITV series, they kind of earmarked two particular estates. One in South London called Myatesfield Estate, which had a hairy reputation. And they thought, let's balance it out. So let's find a hairy reputation-based estate in North London. And it was this place where they came to Andover Estate. So they descended on the estate, again, where I grew up, where I had the privilege of serving. And it's almost as if they wanted to highlight all the hopeless aspects of this community. They descended on the estate, and literally one of the first things from this actual documentary was, oh, well, this place is a dump. And then they went on to highlight the crime. They went on to highlight the areas that were unsafe. They went on to highlight the low socioeconomic background of the community. But funnily enough, we had many members, many local residents that felt quite disgruntled. And it just so happened that there was an opportunity for the local community to make their own video, to make their own documentary, where by God's grace, we were able to literally have what I like to call a scope of hope. We were able to walk the same streets that she walked, the same streets that ITV walked, but give somewhat of a balanced perspective that actually said, actually, yes, you're right. There is crime here. There is violence here. But that's not the whole story. And I think something of being people of hope, as we point to the scope of hope, as we point to God's hand at work in our everyday lives, I think something about that is communicating that we are of a different story, we are of a different narrative, and at the heart of this narrative is a resurrection hope, and that filters into our everyday lives. And so to have a perspective that is solely and only doom and gloom in one sense, I think that's an affront to the redemptive hand at work in everyday situations. So youth ministry was a key place in where this was cultivated for me. In fact, we used to have this event called Soul in the City, and we were tasked to write a little rap about this event called Soul in the City, and it involved the local church getting outside of the walls, serving the community, sharing the gospel, and building relationships on the estate. In fact, there was a particular time prior to me coming to know Christ where a significant evening that led me to know Jesus, or particularly played a part, was there was actually a series of stabbings and shootings that took place on the estate. And with one of the murders that took place, it was so powerful to me that years later, the local church will literally run this Soul in the City event on the heart of the estate, and literally run a church service literally in the same space where one of these young men's lives were taken. And I think that's got, again, this points to something of having that scope of hope, that the same places that have been, you know, marginalized and designated with under the category of despair, there's something about those that call on the name of Jesus going into these same, you know, dry valleys, going into these same places and representing the hope that Jesus Christ brings. So the song that we had literally used to say, you know, even though the bits might be gritty, that means even though the area might be harsh, even though the bits might be gritty, we need to put some soul in this city. And then everyone goes, soul in this city. There's no time to sit and look pretty. We need to put some soul in this city, soul in this city, because we're called to be salt and light, but it takes work, doesn't happen overnight. But if we don't go, who's going to show his light? We need to put some soul in the city. So my formation as a youth minister was so significant to who I am to this very day on Andover Estate. And then went on to move to West London as a community minister. And that's where I met Luke. I had the honor of coordinating the homeless ministry drop-in that we had there. But then we also had a variety of outreach and evangelistic ministries that I had oversight over. And then I also had the privilege of for a short span of time, overseeing the young adults congregation. But in this time, there was an inward grappling taking place. Because in my youth ministry days, I also had a youth program that went into local schools to coach and mentor students. And there was a pragmatic element, I must be honest, whereby essentially when I got married, I was like, I'm a youth worker and I kind of need to pay the bills. So there was a really pragmatic sense where I was like, okay, maybe I can do this on the side. But over some time, I realized that the tension was, but James, this doesn't seem like youth ministry. It doesn't seem like your typical classic church staff activity. But even within that, there was this sense of, no, but God is in this though, James. God is deeply in this. So in the time between where it says youth ministry and community ministry, I know there's simple statements there. But actually within those statements, there's 9 years of grappling with, Lord, are you calling me to be ordained? Are you calling me to the pastorate? But then there was this tension actually. That word that's been mentioned, there was this tension. So as you can see, eventually where I am now, there's a variety of ways that refer to the work that I do, but edupreneur is one of them. This mix, a culmination of entrepreneurship and education. That's where I find myself now. But again, there was a variety of tensions that were experienced. So again, as we continue, I just want to reread. I just want this passage in one sense to almost like set the tone of my time today. I'm just going to read it again. It says this: you are the salt of the earth. But if the salt loses its saltiness, how can it be made salty again? It is no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled underfoot. You are the light of the world. A town built on a hill cannot be hidden. Neither do people light a lamp and put it under a bowl. Instead, they put it on its stand, and it gives light to everyone in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before others, that they may see your good deeds and glorify your Father in heaven. And for a long time, I concluded that what this looked like for me took place in the shape of me being on church staff as a community minister, as a youth minister, and eventually, who knows, maybe God's calling me to be an ordained vicar. But God had other plans. God had other plans. As I said, there was this tension within, this sacred and secular divide tension. This church staff minister, or this entrepreneurial education, coaching, mentoring person that shines his light for Christ in the everyday lives. There was this tension. And I grappled with it for 9 years or so. But it all came to a particular point where this was just before I moved on. The staff team that I was on, when it was our birthdays, we would pray for one another. And I had a deep sense that the children's worker was going to have, just that she was going to have a prophetic word that would be very significant. So I felt like the Lord was saying, really listen to her. And she went on that day to share a variety of prophetic words that resonated so much with me running my business full time. Why this is significant though, is because for a very long time, I had to go on a variety of these topics of tensions, like, should Christians be in business? Isn't money evil? Surely it's a greedy thing to be a businessman. Surely the ideal is to be on church staff. But when this prophetic word was shared, it literally started to, and I'll say started to, not immediately, but it started to really undermine some of these assumptions and entrenched paradigms that I had. And I'm so happy that it did, because it's enabled me to continue to be salt and light by the grace of God and meet people I would never had met being on the church staff team. You know, while I was on church staff team, I was so aware of the fact that on a Sunday, there was like 150 people gathering to worship the Lord. And as we know, meeting together, even more so off the back of the pandemic, is such a pleasure. It's it's a treasure. But then I was also quite aware of the fact that Monday or Tuesday, when we will have our staff meeting, there will be about 12 of us in this massive building, and the rest of the church is out in the world. So it's like a lot of my theological reflection came, how are we ensuring that we are effectively serving the body so that they can truly be salt and light in the world? I just didn't know that God was saying, actually, James, I want you to do that. So after this is one of them. See, just before making this big leap, I remember going to Focus, which is a really, some of you might be aware of Focus, it's this Christian event. And there was thousands of people there. Now, just a few weeks before that, I went to an education event, and there was this speaker. She was well known. And as she was speaking, as she was communicating, again, this is just in the education sector, this wasn't youth ministry. As she was speaking, in my spirit, there was this sense of like God's hand is on her life. But in my mind, I'm like, but James, like, I didn't know what to do with it. But all I know is that as she was communicating, I just experienced something of like God's hand on her life. And then what took place, what happened is that I find myself at Focus where there's about 8,000 people. I was there with the church and my wife, and it was time for the evening meeting. And so I walk over to the evening tent. You might see an example of that in the top of the screen there. And as I walk over, I see that same lady there outside of the tent, looking absolutely lost, confused, dumbfounded. She just looked like a rabbit in the headlights. And she was, because she wasn't a Christian, but she had a Christian friend that had invited her to Focus. So I've noticed her. I don't know her. I've only know of her and saw her about 3 weeks before. And I've gone over to her and I've said, I was at that event. I think you absolutely smashed it. It's great to see you here. Bear in mind, she doesn't know me from anywhere. And I came to find out later that she thought that I was going to try and chat her up. And I don't know where she would have got that from. So she's thinking, who's this guy? And then she said she thought I've got the wrong person. But I said her name. It turns out that particular time in her life, she was grappling with this whole idea of, I get this sense that Jesus is calling me, but I've got this education business that I absolutely love, and I don't see how they match. Do they match? And then out of the blue, out of thousands of people, this one, bright-eyed guy called James Aidoo sees her standing outside of a tent where people are meeting to worship. About that, like 7,000 people would meet each night. And I just happened to walk up to her and identify her, just to say, yeah, I saw you there, but we're also here. God wants to use you there, and he also has places and purposes for you here. That's what she walked away with. She walked away with, wow. It might have seemed like a small thing to that young guy called James, but that was a big thing to me, because that kind of shows me that this whole business thing and my faith, it can marry. She knows and loves the Lord right now. She's being discipled by a good friend of mine right now, and she's growing in her faith by the grace of God as we speak. We're friends now as well. And what was so powerful about this particular story of hope was this: the significance of our encounter was powerful for her, because she was able to see how her faith and the work that she's so passionately called to, but didn't know it in those terms at that point, that how they can be married. But that was the same message for me. That was the same message for me. So again, just that reminder, I just want to read this passage again, just over us. You are the salt of the earth. But if the salt loses its saltiness, how can it be made salty again? It is no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled underfoot. You are the light of the world. A town built on a hill cannot be hidden. Neither do people light a lamp and put it under a bowl. Instead, they put it on its stand and give light to everyone in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before others, that they may see your good deeds and glorify your Father in heaven. As I come to land the plane, so to speak, there was that powerful theme that I loved what was shared in that we're not human doings, we're human beings. Something of who we are is almost like ontologically interwoven with this story of hope, simply because Jesus is the perfect embodiment of hope. And we get to share in that by being his ambassadors as salt and as light. And I think more and more, actually, it's getting more and more exciting how actually for those that are in the entrepreneurial business space, there's something quite powerful about being able to authentically share who we are because of whose we are in Christ in a space that isn't your typical space where some of these conversations might take place. So I just want to remind us that, you know, we're salt and light. We're called to be salt and light, but it takes work, doesn't happen overnight. But if we don't go, who's going to show his light? That's who we are. We're salt and light. We're called to have a scope of hope in the everyday lives of everyday people. Yeah, thank you very much.